Peter Attia says a lot of things. He's a world-leading expert in longevity, a lot of people say, but what about the words of advice that he gives? Are they actually worth listening to? Well, today I'm going to try and break through some of these things with a very, very special guest, Eddie Goki. Eddie is an expert in human physiology and biochemistry. If you haven't seen his stuff already, I absolutely implore you to do so. I'll put a link to his things in the description below, and I promise you, you will not be disappointed. He has a wealth of knowledge, and he is incredible at taking people down and busting through all the myths. So I cannot wait to get him involved in this today. Eddie, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, man.
So what I'll do, I've got a specific video here that I've chosen because it kind of shows a lot of Peter's views on nutrition in one video instead of us having to trawl through loads and loads of different clips. Eddie hasn't seen this before, so it's going to be a first time viewing for him. I have because I wanted to choose the right video. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun with this, so let's check it out. This is his co-host. He is asking Peter a question to start with, so let's take a look at the question to start with.
Do you maybe want to take a minute to talk about why nutrition research is so flawed and so hard to do? And then because that's true, that kind of affects everything you look at within nutritional epidemiology and trying to understand kind of that question of which diet is quote unquote best.
So I think the question is good. I think we would both agree. And he's hit the nail on the head. Nutrition is incredibly difficult to study. As I'm sure we would both say, like, there's so many variables, right? Yeah. What do you think about his question of, in terms of understanding which diet is best? Because that kind of alludes to their way of thinking already.
Yeah. So, in terms of using human nutrition science, which is based on, people have heard the term inferential statistics before. You're making observational inferences on in a certain population or multiple populations, and then you're extrapolating the results mathematically, basically, to the overall population at large. So that has uses, that science does have uses, and I know on my channel I usually say that it's not science at all because science requires experimentation, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But it is science because you do employ the scientific method. It's just the problem arises when you start extrapolating it in spheres where there are better sciences to derive said inferences from. Human nutrition is a perfect example of that. The thing about human nutrition science, when you try and, employ that sort of method on human nutrition and trying to derive or infer what we should be eating, is that you cannot, like I just said, experiment on human beings because experimentation requires control. And you cannot control for human beings because in order to do such a thing, you have to take two phenotypically and genotypically identical twins at birth, as soon as they're born, and then put them into two metabolic ward lock-in rooms, observe them over their entire lives. If attempting to infer lifelong health outcomes, that's exactly what you want to do. 40 years for 40-year-long health outcomes, etc. And then the hardest part, actually, it already sounds implausible, because it is, but the hardest part is you have to control for every single variable, including the time they wake up, the time they go to bed, their stress levels, their hormone levels. It's implausible for obvious reasons. It's unethical, wouldn't get past an ethics committee, rightfully so. And also, I can't imagine the price of that type of study that would cost an exorbitant amount of money. And so when it comes to human nutrition, automatically, immediately, you can say, okay, well, you're not going to get the best inferences that you can, so then you must ask yourself, well, are there better sciences that you can observe first and foremost beforehand? And it turns out that it seems to be the case that, yes, there are sciences that you can establish cause and effect relationships in between things like how glucose is going to affect the body, how compounds like cyanide affect the body, and whether they're indicated or not. Biochemistry and cellular biology is a very good one. A subsection of cellular biology is cancer biology. That gives you some good inferences as well, actually. But then you've got things like observational paleoanthropology. Even though it's still observational, you get better inferences from that, and also chemical anthropology. And there's many others like comparative anatomy. And so there's already inherent problems with that, let alone the fact that there's different types of human nutrition science, some of which are worse than others, actually. So
Yeah, absolutely.
that's what I have to
I
say about
think,
that. Yeah.
yeah, I completely agree. You've hit the nail on the head, and I think the question actually says quite a lot because what he's asked is, which diet do you think is best? And that kind of implies that there is a subjective opinion as to which diet is best. But actually, as I'm sure we would both agree, you don't need to rely on subjectivity to figure out which diet is quote unquote best. I
Yeah.
mean, first of all, the word best I think is not a good word to use here. I think a phrase like most appropriate for our species is a
Yes.
better phrase than the word best.
Yep.
And like I said, you don't need to rely on subjectivity because there are ways to calculate that, to empirically measure that, which I'm sure we'll get to later on in the video.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with every single thing you said. I'm usually, I get called pedantic on the channel because I'll say things like what you just said, where I don't like the word best. I like to use more accurate terminology. But it's because
Yeah.
if there is any room for misinterpretation of that word, then I'm like, well, that's not my goal. Is to leave things ambiguous and vague and broad. I try to be like extremely specific. I usually try and say the words indicated or most appropriate because those are pretty synonymous, effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Let's see what else we've got. Let's see what Peter's response is to this question.
I think it comes down to the complexity of the organism at question, which is us.
Right.
I think we are a complex organism. I'm sure a lot of people would understand that, but it still has nothing to do with what is the quote unquote best diet, because it's nothing to do with the complexity of the organism in my opinion, and possibly yours. I think it's more to do with what does the isotope testing say. Would you agree?
Exactly. Yes, because that takes into consideration the complexities of the organism. You see, the thing is, with hard science like that, it is inherently reductionist. You can absolutely isolate a variable and then make an objective, very, very accurate inference from that establishment, basically. Isotope tests are a perfect example of that. Yes, there's some variation because it does depend on where you derive the remains, when they are from, and also how long they've existed, because that can also change the isotope ratios. However, we've seen some pretty consistent results when it comes to isotope analyses with respect to our hypercarnivorous nature. As historically and anthropologically. Another perfect example is things like how glucose will affect the body above a physiological concentration within the bloodstream. We always sustain glycation damage even without consuming carbohydrates, which is a fun fact. It's the entire reason why your HbA1c level will never hit 0%. You always are going to sustain it. But the expeditious rate is achieved by consuming the thing, and we know exactly how glucose in isolation via these hard sciences will affect the tissues of the body, for example, within a cell above a certain concentration, within the bloodstream in a certain concentration, and then when you look at like the structures of the body, or rather the pathways of the body, the metabolic pathways of the body, you can put all these pieces together and say, okay, well, carbohydrates. I'm using an isolated example here because I focus on glucose and carbohydrates a lot. Glucose is produced in the exact required amount at any given instance in time by the body if you're not consuming it. It's above a physiological concentration within the bloodstream, induces damage, and it's not required exogenously whatsoever, hence the first thing that I just said. And so the indicated appropriate response to all of that information, which is only two things really, is, well, why should you be consuming it in the first place? I probably shouldn't, or at least I should minimize it to the best degree that I can, the most of a degree that I can. That's usually what I say. And then that's basically how I walk through establishing what is indicated for human physiology. And I think it makes perfect sense. Instead of trying to, derive my inferences from things that are so ambiguous and so confounded, like human nutrition science. That's another reason I call it bread and circuses, because at the end of the day, it sounds a little cynical when I say that, but sometimes it actually, you should be cynical about it because of how much it's bought and paid for as well in certain circumstances. So, but yeah. That's
Yeah, I
basically
completely
my
agree.
philosophy on it. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think we've got exactly the same philosophy, because you don't need to have an opinion on what's best for our species. Like you said, you can measure it.
Right.
If people are interested, I think a good person to look at is Mickey Bendor. The surname is BEN-DOR. Bendor 2017 is a good reference. That was kind of like a meta-analysis looking at lots of different individual studies that looked at stable isotope ratios, and he put them all together in one. Here's a hint, by the way, as to what that says. Carnivore, 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 dot, dot, dot.
Yeah, I read that whole paper. I read his whole paper, and it was really
Yeah,
interesting. He didn't
it's an amazing paper.
Yeah, he didn't just put where we lie on that spectrum. He put where every other animal at that time also lied on the spectrum. I saw that, like the whole graph. It gives you a really, it's sort of, I can imagine that if you've never heard this information before and you look at that, you're like, your mind is like it just blown. You're like, really?
Yeah.
Seriously? But yeah.
Yeah, I'll try and get the paper on screen here potentially, so
Okay.
you guys can have a look as well. Let's see what else Peter has to say.
And the complexity of the intervention, which is eating. So it's really the worst of both worlds, right? It's we can study something as complicated as nutrition in a simple organism that can be put in a cage where you can control everything and where lifespan is short enough that you can actually measure how inputs affect outputs on a reasonable timescale. But
Right.
I think he's technically correct.
Hmm.
You can study those things. So fruit flies, Drosophila are very commonly studied in labs in different fields because you can go through life cycles in a reasonable amount of time to then figure out what happens across generations. However, I think the point we both made before is still valid. It doesn't actually matter whether you have the ability to observe the full life cycle or not, because that doesn't change what is empirically measured through stable isotope testing.
Yep. That's what I would say as well. I mean, it goes right back to the points that we've been making, where, if you believe, if your preconceived notion is that the only way to infer what we should be eating is from this science, then of course you're going to try and justify the use of it. And I think many of these people, they're living in this myopic viewpoint. And I'm not trying to insult them. It's just because I know how it is, because I used to do the same thing years ago. It was like, okay, well, this is, let's try and observe the science, and there's ambiguity here, but let me try and sort out all the confounders and all the details and everything. Well, let's try and shift away from that. Let's try and move away from that. And the that's really my whole point. Is I think it's myopic to do such a thing, and it's just a waste of time. Like, frankly, it is an absolute waste of time. A lot of these papers that come out, I'll read the title and the abstract, if that actually, and I'll be like, well, why do I, and actually, it's a good, I'm glad that I actually brought that up, because Anthony Chafee and Dr. Nagra had that debate a while back, if you remember that. I don't know if you remember seeing that. And one of the reasons why people said that Anthony lost the debate was because he didn't have the knowledge of scientific papers that Matthew Nagra was throwing up, or, he wasn't throwing them up on the screen, but he was, citing them verbally, and he said, well, we shouldn't be looking at that, we should be going back to first principles. Really what he meant by first principles was exactly what we're saying, which is the hard sciences. But people don't really like that answer. I've noticed that people don't really like that answer because of their preconceived notions that that is the only way that we can interpret, what we should be eating as a species. And the other last note that I'll add here, because once again, Peter was pretty much right there, but I just think he's not thinking outside the box, literally, almost. The other thing is that when you see these studies that say, oh, well, a plant-based diet is good at ameliorating this. I just reacted to a video where this PhD, research scientist, said a plant-based diet is very effective at reducing type 1 diabetes symptoms and ameliorating it. And I said, well, there's a lot of things that I can say to that, and I did. But also, define plant-based diet, because there's so many different ways to do that. So let's say that you could control and you force administered one specific diet that is plant-based on these people. You cannot guarantee, you can't just say, well, a plant-based diet then helps in ameliorating type 1 diabetes, because what if the constituents are different when someone else adopts it and decides to, form it from foods that they buy from the store or something? There's so much ambiguity there. It's at that point, you get to the point where there's so many confounding variables that you might as well, you're like, it's a waste of time. It really is.
Exactly.
We got to look at something else. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's why they do what Peter said, like try and do things inside a box.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean it's any better. It doesn't mean it's any more appropriate to any better at figuring out what we should be doing.
Yep.
Let's see what else he has to say.
to be clear, even studying the effects of nutrition in a confined environment using more complicated organisms, such as rhesus monkeys, as was the case in the NIA Wisconsin experiments from the 1980s, which began in the late 80s, I believe. That's an experiment that could never be replicated, right? I mean, it took, north of 20 years to do an experiment in rhesus monkeys where you could still have perfect control over what they ate. And it's not entirely clear what the answer was. That was an experiment that sought to test the question, does caloric restriction extend life?
Again, he's got some valid points, I think. But also, I know he goes on about caloric restriction quite a lot because I haven't read his book, but I think he's said before that he's spoken about it in his book.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people really understand what caloric restriction is. I don't think people understand why it's even coming about? Is it that there's an observed association and benefit because you're eating less nutrients, because that's what you're doing at the end of the day, or because you're eating less rubbish, because there's a big difference between the two. My view on it is that we are obligate hypercarnivores. So actually, we would never have calorie restricted. We would never have done intermittent fasting. We only ended up fasting because there wasn't enough prey for us to eat at that moment in time. I'm guessing you would agree with that.
Yeah, it seems like our physiology over the course of millions of years, since we didn't have prey at all times, every single, second of every day that we could just catch, our physiology has adapted and acclimated to that. And so it seems to be, you could make the argument that given how we know genes work and how they evolve over the course of millions of years, in which the environment in which they're, over the course of time in the environment in which they're placed in, given those stimuli, we could say, you could make an argument that it is indicated to fast once in a while. And I believe that that's probably the case. But I'm not saying it's necessary, but yes, I do believe that. And the other thing that he's bringing up here is, I mean, the thing about Peter is I don't think I've ever had him on the channel, because not much of what he says is so egregious that I have to like react to it. He's pretty level-headed.
I think he's a good speaker. Like, he knows how to come across well. My view is that because he comes across well, people assume everything he's saying is factually correct.
Yeah, that's a problem that, and you can't even, I mean, if you're going to be objective, you can't even say that that's necessarily his fault at the end of the day. But it does make it to where you have to, I think you do have to be extremely, you'd have to be extremely careful with people that sound really, really. I think Paul Saldino is actually a perfect example of this, but I think he's far more.
And plant chompers as well, whatever that guy's name is.
Yes, Chris McCaskill, I think.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yep. If they speak well, it makes it more enticing to the viewer, and if they speak very cogently, that's another point. It's not just about being articulate; it's about being cogent. I think that's a, you have that combination. It's a dangerous combination. But yeah, so to focus on what he just said, where yes, even in the study he's referencing, I'm not familiar with it, but I'm getting some details from it where they studied on these monkeys, which you could say genetically they're closer ancestrally to us than like a mouse or something. But that's the first flaw, though, is that they are not genetically identical to human beings. And first of all, the other problem, I know that people might think this is captious and pedantic again, but you define caloric restriction, because you actually can't even physically do that scientifically. But if you're just talking metaphorically or analogously, like, okay, a restriction of the mass of food that one is consuming. Well, these animals, since they're not genetically identical to us, have their species appropriate diet is far different than us. In fact, I mean, they're not hypercarnivores. They eat some meat. I know that. A lot of, on the plant-based side, they'll say that, primates are like exclusively like vegan or vegetarian or something, and then they'll compare our physiology to us. That's not exactly the case, because they will eat animals if they come across them. But that is another flaw. And in terms of actually replicating the study, like he just said, it is impossible. You can't do such a thing. And so you necessarily, I mean, this is the thing that I find ironic. Peter is telling us already within the first few minutes of this video that there are so many flaws with the science. But then I guarantee at the end of the video, he's going to say, well, we just do the best we can with what we got. And I think, yes, that's true. But science, this science is not the best we got. It's not the best we got. There's other sciences. It always goes back to that point. And I'm trying to study all of those other things first before I even touch on this stuff.
Yeah.
So.
And do you know what? I think this is what makes it a little bit difficult to do reaction videos to Peter, because he said something here about not being able to replicate that study, which is true. Like, he's made a good point. Yeah. And sometimes people, they take that and it kind of covers up the other stuff, like talking about calorie restriction when there's no such thing as a calorie. And this is, I think, something that, I don't know whether he does it consciously or not, but it's taken advantage of, I think. It looks like to me like he's taking advantage of that. Like I said, I don't know if he's doing it on purpose, but I think that's what's so dangerous, like you say, because the good points cover up the bad points almost.
Yes. It's much better almost in a way for someone to be extremely wrong in everything they say, rather than them mixing in good information with bad information, because people will just immediately assume they'll take the good information And
Yeah,
then, because most people listening to this person are looking for answers, so they'll take the good stuff, and then since it's good, or if they implement it, it has positive effects, ostensibly, then they'll take the other stuff that they say at face value and not with any grains of salt whatsoever and adopt that as well. That's
exactly. That's my problem with Peter. But let's see how he carries on from this.
And the answer turned out to be it depends if your monkey lives in Wisconsin or Bethesda, Maryland. Of course, I'm being tongue-in-cheek. I think that study did answer the question if you knew how to read the study. I won't get into that because I think I have a whole chapter devoted to that in the book. So that's basically the long and short of why it's so difficult to study. So when you study it in humans, you can do controlled experiments.
That's a tricky one. I think I'll let you look like you're about to speak. I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, define controlled, because whenever someone says controlled, I immediately think 100% controlled, because at the end of the day, a lot of people think that control is a spectrum. There's some control, 70% control, 80% control. That's not my opinion. If there is 99% control, it is not controlled. It's not controlled. There is that 1% still available for, again, chaos, basically. If we're going to order in chaos, there's still that chaotic element of it. It's not controlled then. You cannot put these people in labs from the time they're born to the time they die or something, and then control for every single variable. It's not going to happen. So
Yeah, for me,
no,
it's either controlled or it's attempted to be controlled.
exactly.
Like there's nothing else.
And just to throw in some epidemiology stuff here, because there are subsections of this human nutrition science. There's interventional trials, which is what we're really focused on right now. But then there's prospective cohort studies, which is epidemiology, where you're not even controlling people. You're not even trying to control people. You're not trying to give them a protocol like, hey, eat this for 2 weeks, and then they're not even trying to do that. Prospective cohort studies is where you take two populations and you compare them, and they're large populations, like you're talking like a country or a region of the world, and you observe, basically, they take very aged populations first of all in order to ensure the occurrence of deaths in the studies, because that's really what they're trying to see is, well, does this increase the risk of death by blank percent or whatever. And not only that, you basically, after the results are conducted and the comparisons between the two populations are established or derived, whatever, they will, since they know that it is so uncontrolled and there's so many confounding variables, what they'll attempt to do is they'll attempt to basically account for risk factors by stacking basically graphs of other risk factors like high blood pressure and all this stuff on top of the original graph that they studied, and they call it adjustment. It's called multivariate regression, where they try and produce a trend line which is like, it has much less error around it. And not only does that actually get you farther and farther away from establishing a causal relationship, because what they're trying to do is try and get closer and closer to establishing a causal relationship, because their theory is that they're accounting for risk factors and all this stuff, the things that they couldn't control. You're actually doing the exact opposite of that, and in many cases you inflate the results so much that you get an entire opposite result from what you studied. So that already shows you that even if you try to control after the study, which is impossible, you get such a bad, result and conclusion. And it's so bad. Like, if you actually look at the raw data in the study, you'll be like, what? A perfect example of that is the Adventist Health Study number 2, I think, which, other people in the space have referenced before for the same reasons, because they reported what they reported was exactly 180 degrees backwards of what they actually observed. Like, completely. That's not even an exaggeration. It was just, they just flipped it around. And it was because they knew that if they stacked a bunch of these univariate regressions that they didn't observe, like, oh, this includes smoking, this is a smoking factor, and this is high blood pressure, and this is this. If you do that after the study, they knew that if you did it enough, you could change the entire result. But then you could make it look innocent by saying, well, it was because we adjusted for all these variables that we couldn't control. Scientists report what they observed, not what they think they would have observed if they had done the study differently, in an ideal world where they could have exerted complete control over their populations. So you cannot control for human beings.
No.
And at this point, we're beating a dead horse, it seems.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think when you plot results on a graph, and there's no kind of clear line of best fit, what a lot of people in the public don't realize is sometimes when there is a line of best fit, that's been done by altering the results to kind of compress the results together to create a line of best fit.
Yep. Yep,
Yeah.
that's exactly what that is. And if you
Yeah.
do that enough, you can change the result. And that's what I mean.
Exactly.
And that's just they now know that they can do that strategically in
Yeah.
order to get the results they
Exactly.
want. So, and the other thing is actually, a lot of people don't realize that sometimes they do that in order to prove their hypothesis true, which is exactly, it's unscientific because your entire role as a scientist is to disprove your hypothesis. But the reason they do it is because a lot of people don't realize that in epidemiological journals, scientists are prevented from publishing results that disprove their hypothesis within them. So if they conduct a study where 13 of them, had a result that disproved their hypothesis, but there were 3 that did prove it, if you just do the study enough, sometimes that includes p-hacking as well, and we can talk about that later, but then that epidemiological journal will take those 3 studies, irrespective of the other 13 that exist that disprove your hypothesis.
Yeah.
So that's another.
Ansel Keys. Like that you just described Ansel Keys there, basically.
Yeah, the person. Yeah. But and it's just it's a problem. There's a lot of fraud. Even a lot of people want to blame only the scientists solely, but I mean, it's
There's
the
more to
heads
it.
of the scientific journals primarily, actually. Yep, exactly. So
There's money.
a lot of time they're incentivized to change the results into things like that via those methods. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if it gets any better.
in a research setting, but by definition, they can't tell you anything about health in the long-term sense because it would be almost impossible to confine humans for more than a month or so and control everything they ate. So one can do those types of experiments to understand very precise mechanisms of action, but those rarely translate to a clear understanding of health. If you want to understand what happens over the course of a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, by definition, you have to do that outside of a hospital, and you have to do it with patients being able to eat what they want. There are some historical exceptions to this rule. So, for example, the Minnesota coronary study, I think the actual intervention was probably closer to 3 or 4 years. I could be wrong on that. But it was done on patients in a nursing home.
Yeah.
And, there you had the interesting situation where you had patients who were relatively old, therefore at high risk for ASCVD, but the investigators had complete control over what those patients ate because every meal was being provided to them.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think he used the word risk a little bit inappropriately there, I think.
Yep.
It should be association again.
Trying to
But
be as forgiving as possible with the
yeah,
video.
exactly. And I think what he said there is not dumb. It's not stupid. He's actually spoken quite a lot of sense. But I know it's all going to go downhill in a minute. But again, this is that roller coaster that I personally feel Peter does quite a lot, where he says something sensible and is correct, followed by something that isn't, and you just go up and down and up and down. You only see the up, like exactly what you said, and you assume it's all correct. Do you
Yep.
disagree with anything that he's just said there?
Yeah, besides the risk thing, because like I said,
Yeah.
we're going to be as forgiving as possible. Because at the end
Yeah.
of the day, just because you're older does not mean that your risk of cardiovascular disease is up and increased.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, I think actually everything he said up to this point has been pretty okay. He's actually one of
Yeah.
the only health commentators that I've heard besides like Bart K, for example, who has actually has admitted this, because a lot of people, and I think it's because of the element of humanity that basically we all have, that wants to be convicting about things and establish order in places where it shouldn't be established. Because humans inherently don't like ambiguity, we don't like chaos, and so we try to establish order in every area that we can. We don't like not knowing things, and so if you can establish it, even if it is irresponsible to do so, if we establish a causal relationship between things, we find it easier to live our lives. So
Yeah.
that seems to be why a lot of people won't admit that, and they'll just
Yeah.
cling on to that. Peter, at least, is someone who I've seen is not doing that at all. He's actually coming clean and saying, okay, yeah, that's not the case. Unfortunately, the science cannot do exactly what all these, basically 99.99% of health influencers want it to, and claim it to do. And so I do actually respect that. I'm just worried now
Same.
because like you just said, if someone builds up this argument and it's really good, it almost
Yeah.
makes you worry even more, because you're like, okay, well, if you mess it up, it's going to be worse than if you got everything wrong beforehand.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you're doing your math right all the way up to this point. The whiteboard's full. So, the the number after the equal sign. Let's hope it's right. That's kind
Yeah.
of that's the
And this is
analogy I use.
why this is why I thought this video was good because it shows the good and the bad. It shows the up and the down. Because I think it's important to show a balanced view, and it's true that he's not saying stupid stuff all the time. But
Yeah.
let's see what he shows after this.
That experiment was rather interesting in that it did not yield what the hypothesis suggested. And again, I think there's lots that could be learned from that potentially. But this is why nutrition in humans tends to rely heavily on epidemiology, where you are looking for patterns without doing an experiment, without randomization.
So with your patients then, are you still continuing to try and manage their nutrition, manage their diet, not to you put everyone on the same diet, but more so what is that patient doing and how do you get the best metabolic health for that patient?
Yeah, I mean, we think that the most important parameter for determining metabolic health is energy balance.
I think there's a lot we can say about that. Do you want to take this one?
Well, I mean, at least he said that we think, because a lot
Yeah.
of people will just say that it is the case. Again, establishing conviction and being convicting with your language when, it's just an opinion and it's based upon observations. So at least he said we think, glass half full kind of
Yeah.
perspective here. So I'm not sure who he's referring to when he says we. I don't know if he means like the other scientists that he works with, if he even works with other scientists. I don't think that he is a scientist in and of himself. I think he's an MD.
Yes, he is, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So then it can't be that.
Yeah.
So he says we think probably the other, peer
I think it's
doctors
the
and-
clinic and the people that he works with, I'm assuming,
yeah.
and the other guys that he's got at his workplace.
So now, if we're going to break apart what he just said, in granular detail, when he says energy balance, there are a lot of problems. I've actually cited about like 5 studies on my screen, and I'll do it all at once because they all sort of say the same thing. Where the energy balance model of weight and health overall is extremely flawed. If you use a mass balance model, which seems like once again you're using trivial semantics and stuff like that, but it's not, and I can get into why. That is a much better indicator. So whenever he says energy balance, what he's talking about is exactly what he said in the beginning when he's talking about caloric restriction or caloric surplus in certain circumstances. But really what he means is caloric restriction. And what he means by caloric restriction, once again, is restricting the amount of food you eat. And when he is this vague about it, and I'm pretty sure he's vague about it in all of his other videos as well, it may not, it is completely irrespective of the makeup of the diet. So there are a lot of people in the sort of, to put it frankly, the meathead part of the fitness industry that will just say, as long as you cut your calories, irrespective of the makeup of the diet, the constituents of the diet, you will not only lose weight, which you may very well do such a thing, it's just not the most, salubrious approach to doing such a thing. The other problem, though, is that they will also say that it'll invariably necessarily improve your health. We'll say that diabetes, for example, is caused by caloric surplus or something, overeating. No matter what the biochemistry tells us, which is that, diabetes is exclusively and explicitly characterized as chronically elevated blood glucose and nothing else. And how are you going to get that to a truly pathological degree? It's by consuming carbohydrates, not fat, and not really protein, because try and get that much protein down to the point where you have diabetes, excluding the carbohydrates. If you Once again, it seems like he's making this error where he says exactly what you just said. Like you pretty much summed it up, where he says all these flaws about the science, but then still relies on it to try and infer the sources of disease or something, or the causes of disease and exacerbators of disease. And he says that, apparently he thinks that the number one factor is caloric consumption or something. Caloric restriction is conducive to ameliorating this and that. And I disagree with the opinion. Like I said, he says that we think, so at least he actually stated it as an opinion. I don't think that's the case at all, because if we are going to be colloquial with what that means restricting massive food intake, and from even just anecdotal experience, but from all the observations we see, it really seems to be the case that when you do such a thing, you will wreck your metabolism. Which is, I mean, that is a vague term. Like, what do you mean wreck metabolism? But the thing is, when you restrict the nutritional content of your diet, so let's say you have a really bad diet, okay, like ultra processed foods, Twinkies, cookies, and all that stuff, and you restrict the amount of food that you are consuming, but the diet remains the same, that may arguably actually be worse, because now the only thing that your body is actually is using is glucose in that scenario, and some, rancid polyunsaturated fatty acids. But now you've reduced even that, and so that could actually make you even worse. And I've seen it in personal experience. People that are eating like oranges and ice cubes only, exclusively, to try and lose weight, and they do lose like a few pounds, but they are stagnant at like 150 or something. And it's like they cannot lose it. And not only that, they're remaining, excessively adipose, let's say, but they are starving themselves to the point where they have extreme brain fog, and they have no energy. They sleep for like 13 hours a day or something to try and, replenish their energy stores. And so, no, I don't think that is an approach to here's the thing. What if it's just the case that that caloric surplus, so to speak, is associated with poor health outcomes, because people that are eating in a caloric surplus are eating bad foods, because the only way that you can actually get into a caloric surplus is by eating extremely bad foods. So again, just based on observations, just based and you can derive your opinions from that if you want. It exists for a reason. But there are better inferences, or better areas where you can establish better inferences from or derive them. And again, just right back to the very beginning of the video where we were talking about that, I don't think
Yeah.
it was a good idea to get it from just the science at all.
I think even the word energy, I don't like that
No.
word being used in this context. Like you said, I think mass of food is probably the most appropriate that we would say, because you can't measure the energy in food like
Nope.
in a way that's appropriate to our metabolic process.
Exactly.
And again, that's being a little bit pedantic, but I would say it's an appropriate level of being pedantic, because people are going to take genuine advice from how to live their lives from videos like this. And if you leave things open to interpretation, you leave things open to negative outcomes in people. So you have to be more specific than using the word energy as well. That's my biggest problem with that anyway.
Exactly. And not only that, hormones don't have an effect on energy or calories,
Exactly.
for example. They have an effect on mass.
Yeah.
And they also have an effect on, by the way, if people want to use the calorie model, they have an effect on how many calories you release from your body. Because, for example, lower insulin homeostatically, that leads to a phenomenon in your fat cells, for example, where they actually release more heat than they otherwise would if they were white adipose tissue. You hear the brown adipose tissue versus white adipose tissue. They actually will release more calories that way, even at basal activity. So that's another thing. I mean, you got, it's much more sophisticated than simply the first law of thermodynamics, or calories in, calories out. And that's what I try and tell people. So if they do want to measure the amount of food they're consuming, if they really want to do that, which that can be depending on the context, and I think in the majority of context that can be an unhealthy behavior. I've tried to do it just for fun, and it wasn't even sustainable for me. And it wasn't. I was just like, oh, I'm curious, how much protein am I eating? And I did it for 2 weeks, and I missed many of the days actually. It's just like, really, you have to be like so meticulous about it. But if you wanted to do that, then yes, I would say to measure mass, because that is an actual accurate measurement. Calories can be out by the calorie numbers on food labels are out by up to 20% in either direction, precisely because of the fact that there is so much error around measuring the caloric release of a food when you combust it, which is also what the body doesn't do with food. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Absolutely. Completely agree. I think it's probably going to get a little bit more downhill from here. So let's see the contrast.
Goody. Good.
Even the quote unquote best diet, if it's in excess of energy balance, will produce poor metabolic health.
No, that's too
What he's
convincing. You can't say that. You can't say that. That's not true, per se. That's your opinion.
Also, he said any diet consumed to excess will wreck your health. Anything done to excess in any context is by definition
Also
in
true.
excess.
He didn't
Yeah,
establish what threshold he's referring
exactly.
to. And
Like, same with water. Like, water is
just
essential
say
for
that.
life, but if you drink that to excess, you're going to undergo cytolysis, because there's too much water going from the bloodstream into the cells down the water potential gradient, and then basically
Yes.
just causing cell lysis, right?
Yep.
You can't, this, for me, this is an example of him using words to try and sound authoritative and intelligent, but actually what he's saying is complete rubbish.
Yes.
Because doing anything too much is too much.
Anything. And just to play devil's advocate, because a lot of people
Yeah,
may hear that and they'll say, well, you could say the same thing about the things that we say not to ever consume ever, like glucose.
yeah,
The problem with that is that one of those things is essential for human life, that being exogenous water intake, the other is not. And so if you've got something that is not required for the subserving of a human life, you've got something that above, and that very thing is toxic above a certain degree in the bloodstream, the body can create all of it that it needs at any given instance in time, and there is no evidence to suggest that there's any distressing effects or counterproductive, because that's really the best synonym we have for distressing, effects of depending on gluconeogenesis, for example, for the production of that glucose, then don't consume it. You use that philosophy for all these things like fiber, like plant toxins, all these things. You end up getting towards this sort of diet, even just based on that philosophy alone. And also even if we were going to be very forgiving, because I always do that on my channel, I try to be as forgiving as possible. Let's say he's right. Anything in excess is a bad thing. Try and overconsume things like fat and protein in isolation without carbohydrates, and see how far you get. I just reacted to Dr. Muhammad Allo recently, and that will be out. That will be out soon. And he said the same thing. He said that he was reacting to steak and butter Bella's cholesterol results. It was a lipid panel. It had an A1C and a CRP reading as well, but it was mainly a lipid panel. And he said that this person, which was Bella, has the genes for diabetes, which I had comments on even then when he said it. But he said that means that no matter if she overconsumes her diet, even like if she starts eating 10,000 calories a day, which I commented on that too, then she will still end up with diabetes. And I said, okay, first of all, no, because we know the cause of diabetes. That's not exactly the case. But also, even if that were the case, try and get that much food down. So even if you are going to use that model, why is Peter right now not considering the satiety signaling of certain foods, as opposed to just focusing on the energy model, which also has its own flaws in and of itself? So already in
absolutely.
one sentence, there's so many flaws here.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a lot of people seem to forget is depending on what you eat, it's not just about what you get from that food in that moment. I always try and educate my patients to say it's about what that makes you do after. Because if you just
Yes.
have a steak, like you're probably just going to feel full, like you say, and then you'll just go about your day. If you eat the same amount in carbohydrates, like a cake or something like that,
Oh
you
yeah.
will, when insulin comes in and brings that blood glucose level down, and go into a state of at least relative hypoglycemia, that's
Yeah.
going to make you more hungry, and that is not accounted for in any kind of energy balance
Yeah.
or anything at all. And
No.
you can't measure that either, which is the flaw in this argument.
Yeah, no, you can't measure that at all. And even just, I
Yeah,
mean, you could even just make the argument that if you want to talk about the energy balance model, if you eat something that doesn't make you feel good, the proclivity for you to actually engage in activity afterwards will also influence the energy balance model. So it's like
exactly.
it's this whole multifaceted issue that is not taken into consideration when it comes to the calorie energy balance model.
Yeah,
That is my biggest issue with it. Um, at the moment, at least as I currently speak, because I could probably think of 10 more, but
yeah, same.
anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see what he has to go after this.
Regardless of what you think the best diet is, if you think it's a keto diet or a paleo diet or a low carb diet or a Mediterranean diet or a vegan diet,
Again, he's saying regardless of what you think,
Is the best
he
diet. Yeah.
yeah, it's you the diet isn't an opinion, like we said. Like it comes back to say isotope
Exactly.
testing. Yeah,
I
like
think you and I think like very similarly, because that's
yeah,
exactly
we
what I
do,
was
we
just
do.
that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, well, regardless of what you think the best diet is, and it's like, well, what you're saying, that's sort of an incomplete sentence, because what you mean is best diet based upon this science. And it's like,
Yeah,
well, again, though, it's all predicated upon this science that you just talked about the flaws regarding. You know, we should be using, this is precisely why I think you and I just said that we shouldn't be using the word best diet, because that implies an opinion based on this science. It is the indicated appropriate diet, and that implores you to observe other sciences, because you can't derive that from something that is so ambiguous, such as human nutrition science. You
yeah,
can't do it. It is not
absolutely,
possible. So yeah, that's
absolutely.
also another no. I'm glad that you paused it there, because I was thinking that as it was playing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Even when I watch your videos, I feel like pausing it and you pause it, and then what's in my head you say anyway. So I thought this would be
Yeah,
quite good.
good.
So we'll carry on, and what he's about to say is what happens regardless of which diet you think is best.
Right. Okay.
Take any version of those and consume them to excess to the point where you are no longer in energy balance and you are accumulating.
I
Covered
think
that.
we've covered that. We've covered that. But this next bit is really interesting.
Okay. Okay.
So it's the point where you're accumulating.
Adipose tissue that leaks out of the subcutaneous space
So hang on.
and gets into the liver, gets into the viscera.
I don't think subcutaneous fat leaks into the liver unless I've missed something completely.
I don't think so either. It doesn't. I
Yeah.
don't know the mechanism behind why that would be the
No.
case. And my understanding of human physiology, biochemistry, and
Yeah.
stuff like that doesn't really make any sense.
No.
You
I
want
think
to
the
talk?
body is able to break down fat, utilize it, or maybe
Yep.
redistribute it, but it can't leak from one place to another.
No, I don't think so. I think what he's referring to is, once again, I think there's part of it that he's referring to an association, and basically, without whether he realizes it or not, conveying it as a causal relationship when it's not. But I think another part, I think what he's really referring to is the phenomenon where fat cells, if they get large enough, they seem to be associated with an evolution, a release of inflammatory compounds and cytokines into the bloodstream, which I think, yeah, it seems to be the case that that does happen, and that can cause a catch-22 situation where people that are obese or overweight, or overfat really, will have this problem where these fat cells will start, when they're being broken down by eating like a proper diet, let's say, they're releasing inflammatory mediators which can perpetuate the fat maintenance on their body. I think he's probably referring to that, but the thing is when you talk about fat gain, you must understand that basically the hormone that is required for fat storage to even occur is insulin. So he wants to say that a diet, no matter, irrespective of its contents, he mentioned a keto diet. When I hear a keto diet, I'm usually thinking of plant-based keto, even though keto is really an umbrella term for like ketogenic. So there's a plant-based keto, there's the carnivore diet, which is considered keto. Um, but let's take even just the plant-based keto diet that he's talking about, that is basically, frankly, bereft of protein and carbohydrates. The chances of you, first of all, over consuming that because of how much fiber is in that, it's lower. But let's say you could, the chances of you still becoming, adipose is quite low because there's nothing there to stimulate insulin. Nothing. You see this in type 1 diabetics. So you want to talk about eating something in excess. Let's say that there were no satiety signaling that was sufficient enough to prevent you from doing such a thing, no matter, irrespective of the diet we're referring to. It's not invariably going to lead to fat gain if the insulin response to said bolus of
Yeah,
food or recurring
it's
bolus
low.
is low.
Yeah,
It completely neglects to mention the
yeah,
actual physiology of human beings. This
yeah.
this
I
entire
think
philosophy here.
he's grouped basically all diets into one lump sum, if you like, and hasn't accounted for the fact that we can produce ketone bodies, and certain diets are more conducive to that. And if you're doing that, you're probably in a diet where you can't really consume excess. And that's, again, it sounds pedantic, but it's such a key difference that completely negates the argument that he's made about adiposity.
Yeah.
I've never seen someone who's gone carnivore and gained loads of body fat and become obese. Have you?
No, no. The only time I've heard anecdotes of people doing that, and if you dig deep enough, you'll find the reason why. It really doesn't have anything to do with the diet itself. A lot of times I've noticed that this is a theory, and I think, in my opinion, it's a good theory, but I'll leave it to other people to decide that for themselves. If you have extremely low muscle mass, but you have a lot of fat on your body, it can be a far slower process on carnivore to losing the fat. I've seen that because muscle mass itself will increase basal metabolic rate.
Yeah, more mitochondria, right?
Yes, more mitochondria, so it gives your body
Yeah,
more cells that require fuel. So it can cause you to, but at the end of the day, that could therefore make it more easy to overconsume, let's say on a carnivore diet, because there's less, for your body to use. But in terms of actually someone that increases steadily their weight, I've never actually seen fat, sorry, because muscle, that's weight, and people can increase muscle on carnivore. So But I've never actually seen that personally, and I've never heard too many people talk about that. And once again, if they are talking about it, you dig deep enough and you'll find out, like, okay, maybe they're consuming sweeteners, which can
Yeah,
interfere with insulin responses, and
yeah,
also cause them to eat far more of certain compounds than they otherwise would. Try and overeat on a stick of butter alone. You're not going to do that. Each bite that you take, dip it in some, swerve brown sugar or something. Well, you're going to eat the whole thing, or at least it's more probable
yeah,
probably that you're going to
yeah.
do such a thing. So anyway,
And as well as that, he's said this in a way which makes me. He hasn't said it explicitly, but it kind of alludes to the fact that he's saying you are trying to control, or you need to be trying to control your body fat or your body composition by means of your diet. Personally, I think body composition is just a dependent variable based on having a
yes,
particular phenotypical set of choices. And so, yeah, you're nodding. I mean, we're in agreement again. I think if you eat right and have the correct lifestyle, you don't have to worry about body composition. It is whatever your body requires it to be for optimal function.
yep,
We had body composition that didn't really waver throughout our evolution, and we didn't have calorie tracking apps. We didn't have the ability to choose on a plate exactly what we wanted, or on an Uber Eats delivery menu exactly the things we wanted to maintain body fat or body composition. It's automatic. It's a dependent variable. You have no conscious control, therefore it's a dependent variable. So I think that the argument here is, in terms of linking diet to body composition, that concept is correct, but it's not a concept you need to be worrying about. What you need to be worrying about is making the right phenotypical choices, and that's it, really.
yep, totally agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if it gets better or worse. I can't remember the next bit.
You're going to be unhealthy. I always think people are majoring in the minor and minoring in the major on nutrition when they start to fight in dietary tribes on this stuff.
Again, he's suggesting that there are tribes. There are tribes. Let's be honest. But talking about the idea that some could be right and some could be wrong, I think that's incorrect. It doesn't matter what your opinion is. Again, it goes back to isotope testing.
Yep.
Do you have anything to add to that at all?
No, I don't. And, that's kind of what I was covering in the beginning, where if you are only looking at this kind of science, you're going to have so many different diet tribes because, well,
Yeah,
and also not only that, every single one of them would have a good opinion for holding or have a good case for holding their opinions because it's so ambiguous in that sphere. Now transgress from that and go to someplace else and you'll find a different, answer. That's what I say about that. So
yeah,
yeah.
completely agree. Completely agree.
For some general principles, like I do still think that clinically, in my experience, patients with profound insulin resistance tend to respond better to carbohydrate restriction.
Okay, so
Yeah, take
I
it
don't,
away.
I'm not really a fan of the whole insulin resistance thing because he
No,
says that, well,
neither am I.
in his patients with insulin resistance, well, how was that measured? Because you can't directly measure insulin resistance. It's a measure that is based upon proxy measures such as fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin, and the responses to a glucose bolus, inferred from blood glucose in the insulin in the bloodstream. Um, the insulin resistance thing, you can actually solve an insulin resistant scenario in a matter of hours sometimes if you actually give someone the proper meal. So when he says, well, they respond better to carbohydrate restriction, first of all, my response would be, well, I wonder why. But because what's the thing that's going to cause elevated insulin and elevated blood glucose? I mean, again, when we use the word elevated, that's according to an arbitrary cutoff, sure. And that actually is that's not that's I would argue that's not pedantic at all because it is so conditional. Even we know that A1C is conditional, but so is fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin because if someone has a higher fasting blood glucose after they remove carbohydrates, as compared to a measurement that was taken when they were consuming it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the carbohydrate diet was better because if your body is producing the glucose itself, which it must be doing if you're not consuming carbohydrates, then that necessarily means the body has deemed it appropriate to do such a thing. It will not produce glucose in excess. It is using that glucose, and so it is totally indicated for that to occur. HbA1c, that's, actually, I'm going to try and keep this a little frugal because, I can go into that too. But same thing with insulin. Same thing with insulin, though. I mean, your insulin is going to go out of whack, so to speak, if you're consuming carbohydrates or consuming excessive protein. That is true. But if you're consuming excessive protein, for example, I think the best way to infer whether you're doing something like that or not is based upon a CGM to see if you're spiking versus if it's just a slow, subtle rise and then slow decrease. I think that's probably,
Yeah.
you know,
That's
the best.
exactly what I say to my patients. I think there's a minimum level of protein, and you can kind of gauge that by looking at vegans who don't get enough and they start to wear away. And I
Yeah.
say, and patients ask me, well, how do I know what's too much? And I say, well, I'm not going to give you a figure because it may not be right for you. There is a figure that I generally have in mind. It might be something like 2.5 grams per pound per kilogram of lean mass. However, that's so vague and generic. Even I don't trust that figure that I've come up with based on what I've read. I actually
Yeah.
say to them, put a CGM on, have increasing amounts of protein in a meal, and watch how much protein you need in terms of, say, the mass to see that sort of speed bump of insulin or glucose, if you like. And
Yeah.
that's your limit. That's your version of too much. Completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, the last final comment is just about the whole, the insulin resistance thing and how they respond better to carbohydrate restriction. I mean, even if we're going to play devil's advocate, you could probably see the same thing if you remove all the fat and protein from their diet as well and they consume only carbohydrates. So again, I think he's just
Yeah.
basing all this stuff on associations in his own clinical practice, which is I mean, that's fine.
Yeah.
But it's anyway,
I think it's not good enough what he said, because what he's saying is from his clinical experience he finds there's a better response from diabetics to clinically to restrict carbs. But
yeah.
why do you have to rely on your clinical experience for that? Like
Yeah,
you
no,
shouldn't
it's
need to.
same. That was sort of what I was trying to
Yeah.
get at, and I was
Yeah.
just, I couldn't find the words for it, but yeah, yeah,
Let's see how he finishes off.
As the best tool to reduce total intake. You have to create a caloric deficit in those patients.
So he's saying that they fare better
Yeah.
with carbohydrate restriction because they eat less and that's what. So again, that's his opinion that it's because they're eating less as opposed to them just not eating the thing that spikes insulin and glucose, which I don't know how you can ignore that, by the way. I don't know how you can like see past that. But okay, so he's saying it makes them eat less because I mean, and I'm sure that that's the case because I just covered that. But if he wants to isolate that variable and say that that's the reason, go ahead. But I mean, again, I think that there's far more to that, and honestly, not even far more to that. I think that that's not the cause of the decreased insulin resistance, quote unquote, as the construct that it is. But it's the restriction of carbohydrates itself. Have them eat the same mass of food in the forms of fat and protein that are typically colloquially deemed appropriate on a carnivore diet, and then you compare that to their responses when they were eating the same mass of food intake in a mixed meal scenario. I guarantee that you would. Well, I have strong feelings that you would probably see the response that is deemed to be more a sign of an amelioration of the problem.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah,
mean, there was a study released very recently, actually. Someone sent it to me asking my opinion. I couldn't believe what they actually asked for an opinion on. It was an associative study that looked at meat intake and diabetes. And they found that high meat intake was associated with high levels of diabetes. And I thought, what is the point? That is the most pointless study I've ever seen. Diabetes is high glucose. Meat is not zero, but very, very, very little glucose. Like, if there's an
yep,
association, it's not going to be causal, in which case, what's the point of doing the study? And it's
yeah.
similar to what Peter just said, really.
Yep, I think I'm pretty familiar with what you're talking about. All the
Yeah.
associations. Yeah, the more the red meat increased in these populations, reportedly, by the way, you got an increased incidence of diabetes. But of course, they won't
Yeah.
say incidence; they'll say risk, and also they'll report relative outcome statistics, as opposed to absolute ones. And so you have no
Yeah.
idea what the absolute differences between the two populations they were studying were because they could be extremely low, and actually, usually they are. So
Yeah.
even that,
Absolutely. Let's see what's the last 30 seconds is.
And in my experience, they respond better to carbohydrate restriction than they do straight caloric restriction or fat restriction. Ultimately, it matters most that you can find something that is manageable and sustainable over the long haul. None of this matters if you can, adhere to the perfect diet for 3 months and then you can't. It's better to have a 7 out of 10 diet in terms of quality and perfection that you can sustain indefinitely than a 10 out of 10 diet that you can only sustain for 3 or 6 months.
So Two
Please.
things there. Number one, I don't understand. So he just said that they respond better with carbohydrate restriction as opposed to simply caloric restriction and fat restriction. But is that not a sign to you as to what the problem with insulin resistance is? First of all,
Exactly.
well, we sort of already covered that. But also, when it comes to what was the last thing he said? It was something like, "Oh yeah, so the 7 out of 10 diet versus a 10 out of 10 diet that you can't really sustain that well." I don't like the whole 7 out of 10 versus 10 out of 10 because that's subjective interpretation and an
Yeah.
opinion as to what. Once again, we already covered that part. But let's just even just talk about the sustainability of a carnivore diet, which we would say
Yeah.
probably is the 10 out of 10 diet because it's indicated, right?
100%.
But the sustainability of a carnivore diet, I think a lot of people think that the only thing I just reacted to also Mike Israel, who you may have heard
Okay.
of before,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and he said something very similarly about the carnivore diet. He said that it's very unsustainable because can you really expect yourself to be able to eat only meat for? And then I paused it before he even finished the sentence, and I said, well, who said that it has to only be meat? First of all. And also, who says it has to be the same cut of meat every single day? Who says that? First of all, I'm not even a fan of saying that you can't have certain seasonings if they don't if they don't bother you. I mean, I use black pepper sometimes. It's like the only seasoning I use, but you can make it sustainable while making it as indicated as possible. And I think that this notion that it's only meat, only the same cut of meat as well, and this could be because of other people telling them this in the carnivore sphere, because not everyone's perfect in the sphere, and they sometimes give some what I would deem to be not the best information. It's not the case though. You don't have to do such a thing, and I don't know. The other last comment I'll make about the sustainability of a diet is that if you are finding yourself approaching food for your source of, or a primary source of entertainment, enjoyment, joy in your life, you should probably have a better you should have a better look at your life. And I'm not even saying that, yeah, and I'm not even saying that in an insulting way. Like I've actually, even just from a personal experience like perspective, um whenever I was like completely debilitated and disabled, if anyone that's listening is unaware of my story, I've done a few interviews and I also have a video on my channel about it that touches it in sort of superficial detail. But thanks. Yeah, so it's I was completely debilitated. Whenever that was occurring, my sources of enjoyment were this small. And so I actually was finding myself being like, okay, well, checking the time to see when I can eat next because I was like, yeah, dopamine hit, let's try and have whatever. And so, but if you're not debilitated, whether it be mentally or physically, really, because I mean, both of those can render someone not functional in everyday life. If you were finding yourself basically approaching food for that sense of enjoyment, that is not the fault of the carnivore diet being bereft of like heavy dopamine hitting foods, and therefore, you should make it a 7 out of 10 diet instead of a 10 out of 10. It's a reflection of a personal flaw that needs to be fixed. That's the root cause. So that's another thing that I hear people say, it's not sustainable because you have to only eat this. First of all, you don't have to only eat meat, but there's a lot of other carnivorous foods, and if they don't bother you, then go ahead and consume them. But the other thing is, yes, if you're approaching food for enjoyment, then like as your primary source of enjoyment or one of them, try and nip that in the bud, not blame the
Yeah.
diet. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, that last section was really useful to explain to people why I don't always agree with Peter. Some things I do agree on. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm not a hater, but I think people need to really take a magnifying glass to what he's saying. At the end, he was saying things which sounded quite agreeable, like a 7 out of 10 diet that you can do forever is better than a 10 out of 10 for 3 months. That sounds to the layman like yeah, that's common sense. That sounds right. But you have to understand and really look beyond what the surface level is. You have to see what that alludes to in terms of his scientific thought process. What he's alluding to, what he's saying is there is such a thing as a 7 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 diet.
Right.
Like that doesn't exist.
Right.
And so,
Exactly.
yeah, and that for me is the danger because he says it with so much credibility. He says it in an agreeable way. That's the issue for me personally. But when you look past that, if it was text on a page and you're reading it with your own voice, not his voice saying it to you, I think you would interpret it very, very differently.
Yep.
And that's why I wanted to do this debunking video because I think people need to really scrutinize what he's saying and don't just gloss over. Look at every little thing, because there are points that, as Eddie and I have discussed today, which really just have no scientific basis whatsoever, which is dangerous when a lot of people take the advice from you, I think.
Yep. Yeah, and it's very similar to the whole, balanced diet theology there. A
Yeah,
lot of people are drawn to that because of the word balance. As soon as they hear something or see something that's represented as being balanced, they conflate that necessarily almost with objectivity when that is
yeah,
not the case. I mean, being specific and therefore being exclusive with respect to foods, in the diet realm, does not necessarily mean that you are an ideologue or that you are a diet zealot. It is, in a tribal camp or something. If it's truly the case that those foods are indicated in almost 99% of the things that we have been taught are not only fine but healthy, are not, that's not being an ideologue. That's not being, non-objective, and that's actually being the exact opposite. So no, balance is not necessarily reflective of objectivity, and in many cases, especially in this realm, that's not the case at all. If anything, someone is a theologue if they believe that balance is key and they base it upon the science that we were just talking about,
yeah,
because that science in and of itself is theology. So,
yeah.
I think people have it backwards in a way.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I think Peter is someone who is, in a way, a little bit more. It's not the right word, and I don't mean this word, but I can't think of a better one in my mind right now. But he's a little bit more dangerous than someone like, say, the plant chompers guy, who
yeah,
is just out and out. You can just tell straight away.
yeah,
And this is why I think people need to pay attention to wording a lot more.
agree.
But I hope you've all learned something from this. And there's a very special reason that I wanted to do this specifically with Eddie. I haven't told him this, but a lot of the science that we talked about today is science that helps you understand how to be as healthy as possible, how to have not the best diet, but the most appropriate diet for you as for us as a species. And if that's something that interests you and you really want to learn it and you want to see where all these kind of topics can be learned together in an easy to understand way, I wanted to say to you that Eddie's got a really fantastic book, which I'm reading at the minute. It's called Contraindicated. And he breaks down all of these topics that we've gone through today, starting with how to actually interpret data and why interpretation of data is done so badly today, and then going through into specific things like calories, like energy balances and what energy is and why it's not that relevant for things like this, and even specific toxins. He breaks down a lot of the commonly used toxins in conversations that we hear in this space, but he actually tells you what they are, how they work, why they actually are responsible, or how they're responsible for causing a lot of health issues. And it puts all of these things that you see a lot of people in our space talking about in one specific text that you can dip in and out of or just read straight through. And I'm not just saying this because Eddie's here. I'm doing the video because I wanted this to be almost like an advert for his book, which he hasn't asked me to do. It's brilliant. I'm still reading it and I'm going to do a full review when it comes. So please check it out. Eddie, where can they buy your book?
Yes, so thank you first of all for that, because he's telling the truth. I did not expect that, but basically my book currently, and I hope that it can be more broad in terms of its availability down the line. But I'm an incipient figure in the space, so currently it is on Amazon.
Yeah.
And it is available in ebook format. Side note, we're having a little bit of a problem currently in terms of the availability on that. I'm working with Amazon on that, just for anyone that wants. Usually, a lot of people buy the ebook primarily, but then there's the paperback and the hardcover versions. Those are still available. And yes, it's exactly what he was saying, what Abs was saying here, because I really tried to make it, if any. A really good way of putting it is I tried to make the book almost for myself in a way. Obviously, it was going to be for everyone else, but it was sort of just to get all of my thoughts in order. And I was almost writing it for myself to be like, okay, this is a piece that I want to write to make sure or to assess whether I'm on the right track or not. And it was, as I was writing it, I was like, yeah, I think so. So it was for both other people and myself in a way. But yes, the two main points of the book is to basically start off with a clean slate. So break down all these edifices, these ideological edifices, and just start off with a clean slate and say, okay, well, let's start trying to establish what is indicated for humans to eat and how to live as well, because lifestyle is a big part of this as well,
Sure.
from a totally different perspective and a more responsible one. And so the first chapter or so, we tear that down. Chapter 2 is when we start rebuilding it back up. And chapter 3 is sort of a second part of the book where we dispel a bunch of stuff. The chapter 3 is the man makes the myth and he becomes a legend, because you look at the history of health, science, and you see that a lot it's basically based on lies, even from the very beginning of it. So that's the second part of it, where we just dispel a bunch of other stuff, and then the rest of the book is rebuilding it back up again. So it's sort of this journey where you eventually arrive at the end and go, hey, this happens to be what is ostensibly the most indicated for human beings. And I say ostensibly lightly because, you know, I'm not one to be gratuitously convicting, but I'd like to say, well, you know, we have the evidence. It is hard evidence that this is exactly what it is. And it does so in a way that I tried to make extremely understandable, even for a layperson's perspective. I am working on the second edition currently, which will be released next year, and I'm going to try and make that 1,000 times better in terms of the information contained within it, but also the formatting, because now I am in complete control of the editing and formatting, which previously I was not. So, yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, send me a copy of that, man, when the second one's out, and I'll have a look at that as well when the time comes.
Gladly, yeah.
I'll leave a link to Eddie's book in the description below. Again, I do highly recommend it. He's not asked me to make this video. He's telling the truth. I never told him this. But it's a brilliant, brilliant book. And I think if you are a carnivore, if you're someone who really, really wants to understand nutrition and how things affect you, that is the book to get. So let me know what you think if you get it, and just type in the comments below. But until next time, thank you very much.